Alright, welcome back. So we are on chapter 42, which is Fighting Shadows. It was dark in Aragon's cell when he sat up with a start, electrified. The wrinkle had shifted. He'd felt the magic at the edge of his consciousness for hours, but every time he tried to use it, nothing happened. Eyes bright with nervous energy, he clenched his hands and said, "Naj Reza." With a flap, the cot's blanket flew into the air and crumpled into a ball the size of his fist. It lay on the floor with a soft thump. Exhilarated, Aragon stood. He was weak from his enforced fast, but his excitement overcame his hunger. Now for the real test. He reached out with his mind and felt the lock on the door. Instead of trying to break it or cut it, he simply pushed its eternal mechanism into the unlocked position. With a click, the door creaked inward. When he had first used magic to kill the Urgals and Yakuzik, it consumed nearly all of his strength, but he had grown much stronger since. What once would have exhausted him now only tired him slightly. He cautiously stepped into the hall. I have to find Zarok and the elf. She must be in one of these cells, but there isn't time to look at them. As for Zarok, the Shade might have it with him. He realized that his thinking was still muddled. Why am I out here? I could escape right now, but I went back into the cell and opened the window with magic. But then I wouldn't be able to rescue the elf. Saphira, where are you? I need your help. He silently berated himself for not contacting her sooner. That should have been the first thing he did after getting his power back. Her reply came with surprising alacrity. Aragon, I'm over in Gilead. Don't do anything. Murtagh is on the way. What are... Footsteps interrupted him. He spun around, crouching, as all 6 soldiers marched into the hall. They halted abruptly, eyes flickering between Aragon and the open cell door. Blood drained from their faces. Good. They know who I am. Maybe I can scare them off so we won't have to fight. Charge! Yelled one of the soldiers, running forward. The rest of the men drew their blades and pounded down the hall. It was madness to fight 6 men when he was unarmed and weak, but the thought of his elf kept him in place. He could not force himself to abandon her. Uncertain if the effort would leave him standing, he pulled on his power and raised a hand, the Gedwe Ignazia glowing. Fear showed in the soldiers' eyes, but they were hardened warriors and did not slow. As Aragon opened his mouth to pronounce the fatal words, there was a low buzz, a flicker of motion. One of the men crashed to the floor with an arrow in his back. 2 more were struck before anyone understood what was happening. At the end of the hall, there were soldiers. They had entered. Stood a ragged, bearded man with a bow. A crutch lay on the floor by his feet, apparently unneeded, for he stood tall and straight. The 3 remaining soldiers turned to face this new threat. Aragon took advantage of the confusion. Thrista, he shouted. One of the men clutched his chest and fell. Aragon staggered as the magic took its toll. Another soldier fell, pierced through the neck with an arrow. Don't kill him, called Aragon, seeing his rescuer take aim at the last soldier. The bearded man lowered his bow. Aragon concentrated on the soldier before him. The man was breathing hard. The whites of his eyes showed. He seemed to understand that his life was being spared. You've seen what I can do, said Aragon harshly. If you don't answer my questions, the rest of your life will be spent in utter misery and torment. Now where's my sword? Its sheath and blade are red. And what cell is the elf in? The man clamped his mouth shut. Aragon's palm glowed ominously as he reached for the magic. That was the wrong answer, he snapped. Do you know how much pain a grain of sand can cause you when it's embedded red hot in your stomach? Especially when it doesn't cool off for the next 20 years and slowly burns its way down to your toes. By the time it gets out of you, you'll be an old man. He paused for effect. Unless you tell me what I want. The soldier's eyes bulged, but he remained silent. Aragon scraped some dirt off the stone floor and observed dispassionately. This is a bit more than a piece of sand, but be comforted. It'll burn through you faster. Still, it'll leave a bigger hole. At his word, the dirt stone shone cherry red, though it did not burn his hand. All right, just don't put me in that eye, yelped the soldier. The elf's cell is last to the left. I don't know about your sword, but it's probably in the guard room upstairs. All the weapons are there. Aragon nodded and murmured, Slithra. And the soldier's eyes rolled up in his head, and he collapsed limply. Did you kill him? Aragon looked at the stranger, who was now only a few paces away. He narrowed his eyes, trying to see past the beard. Murtagh, is that you? Yes, said Murtaugh, briefly lifting the beard from his shaven face. I don't want my face seen. Did you kill him? No, he's only asleep. How did you get in? There's no time to explain. We have to get up to the next floor before anyone finds us. There'll be an escape route for us in a few minutes. We don't want to miss it. Did you hear what I said? Asked Aragon, gesturing at the unconscious soldier. There's an elf in the prison. I saw her. We have to rescue her. I need your help. An elf? Murtaugh hurried down the hall, growling. This is a mistake. We should flee while we have the chance. He stopped before the cell the soldier had indicated and produced a ring of keys from under his ragged cloak. I took it from one of the guards, he explained. Aragon motioned for the keys. Murtaugh shrugged and handed them to him. Aragon found the right one and swung the door open. A single beam of moonlight slanted through the window, illuminating the elf's face with a cool silver. She faced him, tense and coiled, ready for whatever happened next. She held her head high, with a queen's demeanor, her eyes dark green, almost black, and slightly angled like a cat's, lifted to Aragon's. Chills shot through him. Their gaze held for a moment, then the elf trembled and collapsed soundlessly. Aragon barely caught her before she struck the floor. She was surprisingly light. The aroma of freshly crushed pine needles surrounded her. Murtaugh entered the cell. She's beautiful, but hurt. We can tend to her later. Are you strong enough to carry her? Aragon shook his head. Then I'll do it, said Murtaugh as he slung the elf across his shoulders. Now, upstairs. He handed Aragon a dagger, then hurried back to the hall littered with soldiers' bodies. With heavy footsteps, Murtaugh led Aragon to the stone-hewn staircase at the end of the hall. As they climbed it, Aragon said, How are we going to get out without being noticed? We're not, grunted Murtaugh. That did not allay Aragon's fears. He listened anxiously for soldiers or anyone else who might be nearby, dreading what might happen if they met the shade. At the head of the stairs was a banquet room filled with broad wooden tables. Shields lined the walls, and the wood ceiling was trusted with curved beams. Murtaugh laid the elf on the table and looked at the ceiling worriedly. Can you talk to Saphira for me? Yes. Tell her to wait another 5 minutes. There were shouts in the distance. Soldiers marched past the entrance to the banquet room. Aragon's mouth tightened with pent-up tension. Whatever you're planning to do, I don't think we have much time. Just tell her and stay out of my sight, snapped Murtaugh, running off. As Aragon relayed the message, he was alarmed to hear men coming up the stairs. Fighting hunger and exhaustion, he dragged the elf off the table and hid her underneath it. He crouched next to her, holding his breath, tightly clenching the dagger. 10 soldiers entered the room. They swept through it hurriedly, looking only under a couple of tables, and continued on their way. Aragon leaned against the table leg, sighing. The respite made him suddenly aware of his burning stomach and parched throat. A tankard and a plate and a half of eaten food on the other side of the room caught his attention. Aragon dashed from his hiding place, grabbed the food, then scurried back to the table. There was an amber beer in the tankard, which he drank in 2 great gulps. Relief seeped through him as the cool liquid ran down his throat, soothing the irritated tissue. He suppressed a belch before ravenously tearing into a hunk of bread. Murtaugh returned carrying Zarok, a strange bow, and an elegant sword without a sheath. Murtaugh gave Zarok to Aragon. I found the other sword and the bow in the guard's room. Never seen weapons like them before, so I assume they're the elves. Let's find out, said Aragon, through a mouthful of bread. The sword, slim and light, was with a curved crossguard, the ends of which narrowed into sharp points, fit the elf's sheath perfectly. There was no way to tell if the bow was hers, but it had been shaped so graceful he doubted it could be anybody else's. What now? He asked, cramming another bite of food into his mouth. We can't just stay here forever. Sooner or later the soldiers will find us. Now, said Murtaugh, taking out his bow and fitting an arrow on the string. We wait. Like I said, our escape has been arranged. You don't understand. There's a shade here. If he finds us, we're doomed. A shade! Exclaimed Murtaugh. In that case, tell Saphira to come immediately. We were going to wait until the watch changed, but delaying even that long is too dangerous now. Aragon relayed the message succinctly, refraining from distracting Saphira with questions. You messed up my plans by escaping yourself, growled Murtaugh, watching the room's entrance for soldiers. Aragon smiled. In that case, perhaps I should have waited. Your timing was perfect, though. I wouldn't have been able to even crawl if I had been forced to fight all those soldiers with magic. Glad to see I could be of some use, remarked Murtaugh. He stiffened as he heard men running nearby. Let's just hope the shade doesn't find us. A cold chuckle filled the banquet room. I'm afraid it's far too late for that. Murtaugh and Aragon spun around. The shade stood alone at the end of the room. In his hand was a pale sword, with a thin scratch on the blade. He unclasped the brooch that held his cape in place and let the garment fall to the floor. His body was like a runner's, thin and compact, but Aragon remembered Brom's warning and knew that the shade's appearance was deceiving. He was many times stronger than a normal human. So, my young rider, do you wish to test yourself against me? Sneered the shade. I shouldn't have trusted the captain when he said you ate all your food. I will not make that mistake again. I'll take care of him, said Murtaugh quietly, putting down his bow and drawing his sword. No, said Aragon under his breath. He wants me alive, not you. I can stand him for a short while, but you'd better have a way out for us. Fine, go, said Murtaugh. You won't have to hold him out for long. I hope not, said Aragon grimly. Let me get some water here. He drew Zarok and slowly advanced. The red blade glinted with light from the torches on the walls. The shade's maroon eyes burned like coals. He laughed softly. Do you really think you can defeat me, Dusundavar Foran? What a pitiful name. I would have expected something more subtle from you, but I suppose that's all you're capable of. Aragon refused to let himself be goaded. He stared at the shade's face, waiting for a flicker of his eyes or twitch of his lip, anything that would betray his next move. I can't use magic for fear of provoking him to do the same. He has to think that he can win without resorting to it, which he probably can. Before either of them moved, the ceiling boomed and shook. Dust billowed from it and turned the air gray while pieces of wood fell around them, shattering on the floor. From the roof came screams and the sound of clashing metal. Afraid of being brained by the falling timber, Aragon flicked his eyes upward. The shade took advantage of his distraction and attacked. Aragon barely managed to get Zarok up in time to block the slash at his ribs. Their blades met with a clang that jarred his teeth and numbed his arm. Hellfire strong! He grasped Zarok with both hands and swung with all his might at the shade's head. The shade blocked him with ease, whipping his sword through the air faster than Aragon thought possible. Terrible screeches sounded above them, like iron spikes being drawn across rock. 3 large cracks split the ceiling. Shingles from the slate roof fell through the fissures. Aragon ignored them, even when one of them smashed on the floor next to him, though he had trained with a master of the blade, Brom, and Murtaugh, who was also a deadly swordsman. He had never been this outclassed. The shade was playing with him. Aragon retreated towards Murtaugh, arms trembling as he parried the shade's blows. Each one seemed more powerful than the last. Aragon was no longer strong enough to call upon magic for help, even if he wanted to. Then, with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, the shade knocked Zarok out of Aragon's hand. The force of the blow sent him to his knees, where he stayed, panting. The screeching was louder than ever. Whatever was happening, it was getting closer. The shade stared down at him haughtily. A powerful piece you may be in the game that is being played, but I'm disappointed that this is your best. If the other riders were this weak, they may have controlled the Empire only through sheer numbers. Aragon looked up and shook his head. He had figured out Murtaugh's plan. Saphira, now would be a good time. No, you forgot something. And what might that be? Asked the shade, mockingly. There was a thunderous reverberation as the chunk of the ceiling was torn away to reveal the night sky. The dragons! Roared Aragon. Over the noise, he threw himself out of the shade's reach. The shade snarled in rage, swinging his sword viciously. He missed and lunged. Surprise spread across his face as one of Murtaugh's arrows sprouted from his shoulder. The shade laughed and snapped the arrow off with 2 fingers. You'll have to do better than that if you want to stop me. The next arrow caught him between the eyes. The shade howled with agony and writhed, covering his face. His skin turned gray. Mist formed in the air around him, obscuring his figure, which was a shattering cry. Then the cloud vanished. Where the shade had been, nothing was left but his cape and a pile of clothes. "You killed him!" exclaimed Aragon. He knew of only 2 heroes of legend who had survived slaying a shade. "I'm not so sure," said Murtaugh. A man shouted. "That's it. He failed. Go in and get them." Soldiers with nets and spears poured into the banquet room from both ends. Aragon and Murtaugh backed up against the wall, dragging the elf with them. The men formed a menacing half-circle around them. Then Saphira stuck her head in through the hole in the ceiling and roared. She gripped the edge of the opening with her powerful talons and ripped off another large section of the ceiling. 3 of the soldiers turned and ran, but the rest held their positions. With a resounding report, the center beam of the ceiling cracked and rained down heavy shingles. Confusion scattered the ranks as they tried to dodge the deadly barrage. Aragon and Murtaugh pressed against the wall to avoid the falling debris. Saphira roared again, and the soldiers fled, some getting crushed on the way. With a final titanic effort, Saphira tore off the rest of the ceiling before jumping into the banquet hall, with her wings folded. Her weight splintered a table with a sharp crunch. Crying out with relief, Aragon threw his arms around her. She hummed contentedly. "I've missed you, little one." "Same here. There's someone else with us. Can you carry 3? "Of course," she said, kicking shingles and tables out of the way so she could take off. Murtaugh and Aragon pulled the elf out of hiding. Saphira hissed in surprise as she saw her. "An elf?" "Yes, the woman I saw in my dreams," said Aragon, picking up Zorok. He helped Murtaugh secure the elf into the saddle. Then they both climbed onto Saphira. "I heard the fighting on the roof. Are there men up there?" "There were, but no more. Are you ready?" "Yes." Saphira leapt out of the banquet hall and onto the fortress's roof, where the bodies of the watchmen lay scattered. "Look," said Murtaugh, pointing. A row of archers filled the tower on the other side of the roofless hall. "Saphira, you have to take off now," warned Aragon. She unfurled her wings, ran towards the edge of the building, and propelled them over her with powerful legs. The extra weight on her back made them drop alarmingly. As she struggled to gain altitude, Aragon could hear the musical twang of bowstrings being released. Arrows whizzed towards them in the dark. Saphira roared with pain as she was struck and quickly rolled to the left to avoid the next volley. More arrows perforated the sky, but the night protected them from the shaft's deadly bite. Duressed, Aragon bent over Saphira's neck. "Where are you hurt?" "My wings are pierced. One of the arrows didn't go all the way through. It's still there." Her breathing was labored and heavy. "How far can you take us?" "Far enough." Aragon clutched the elf tightly as they skimmed over Gilead. They then left the city behind and veered eastward, soaring upward through the night. And that is the end of that chapter. And I'll read the others at a later date.